Hi everybody, I'm Dave Thomas, and today I am building the Vanishing Point two-stage rocket from Custom Rockets. Now both the manufacturer and I assume that in building this you've already built several single-stage rockets and you're familiar with the basics of model rocket construction. If this is your first rocket, I would suggest trying a few other easier rockets first before doing this one. Alright, let's go ahead and open this up and make sure we have all the pieces. So here's our instructions, and in my kit the fin stock and the decals were in the instruction pamphlet here, so if you're missing something don't forget to look in that spot. Okay, so we've found here our fin material, got our decals. Alright, we've got a small parts package here, and that looks like a motor mount, some centering rings, a thrust ring, and a launch lug. Okay, main body tube, upper part of a nose cone, lower body tube, oh, there's a lower body tube. What do we got here? Oh, this is the upper part of the upper body tube, and this is the booster body tube. Alright, and then we've got another small parts package that includes the base of the nose cone, two couplers, and another engine tube for the booster. We've got a shock cord and a parachute. Okay, so let's go through this quick. Alright. And it looks like we have everything. So I'm going to clear this away and we will get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is make the booster motor mount. And this will require parts from both of the small parts bags. So the actual booster motor mount is in the bag with the couplers. Okay, so it's the shorter of the two BT20 body tubes. The longer one here is for the upper stage. Alright, and we'll need two of these centering rings. Right there. Okay, now this first part goes together pretty quickly. The centering rings will be glued flush to each end of the motor mount here, so that's relatively easy to do. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use some wood glue, and you can use white glue here as well. Okay, and I'm just going to put a bead of glue here around an end, like that. I'm going to take one of my rings and put this on and kind of twist it as I do so, just until it's flush there. Okay, and I can use paper to make sure everything's nice and flush, and then I'm going to go ahead and just smooth this into a fillet. And then once more I'm going to press that down to make sure it is flush. Okay, and I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other end. Trying to do this without dropping it. Alright, the same way, I'm just going to bring that till it's flush. Press it down there. Alright, smooth into a fillet. Okay, and then press it one more time, make sure it's where it needs to be. Okay, now I'm going to let this dry for about 20 to 30 minutes before I go on to the next part here, because I don't want these centering rings moving on me while we try and put it into the booster tube there. Now while we're waiting for the booster motor mount to dry, we can go ahead and assemble the sustainer motor mount. Okay, so we'll need all the other rings there and the longer of the two BT20 tubes there. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is put a small amount of glue. They suggest putting it in the tube and then putting this in. I'm actually going to put it on the ring first so that any excess goes to the outside and not down in the tube where it could interfere with the motor. Okay, so here, put the ring on my finger. And I'm putting the glue around toward one edge, just so when I put this in, it'll force it up around it. Okay, and so that engine block just goes in until it's flush with one end. Okay, and now I'm going to wipe that excess, and now I'm just going to put this down on my paper so that it's flush. Okay, and then I'm going to just put a little bit of glue around that. Okay, I'm going to let that dry. Okay, and now on the aft end of the sustainer motor mount, we're going to make a mark at 3/4 of an inch from the aft end. Okay, so forward end has my thrust ring in it. So 3/4 of an inch will be right here. Alright, and now these are going to fit over this, and I'm just dry fitting these at the moment. Okay, the aft centering ring should be inside the line that we just made. The forward centering ring will be flush with the forward end. Okay, so in both cases here, I'm going to go ahead and pull this down so that any excess glue goes forward, because I don't want anything to interfere down in here with the coupler that's going to go on and couple the two stages together. Okay, so here on the aft ring, just going to run a bead of glue around there. All right, and then I'm going to push this forward until I see my line. There it is. Pull it back just a bit. Okay, and now form a fillet here. Okay, now I want to wipe off anything that got on the outer surface here, or that might interfere with putting this up into the body tube. Okay, and if it's still, if wiping it off doesn't help enough, then we'll just use a little sandpaper later on. Okay, over here, I'm going to push this down a little bit. Once again, put some glue around there. Okay, and I'm just going to move this up. I'm going to twist as I go, as I had a lot of glue on one side. Okay, and then we'll wipe off the excess glue there, and I'm going to put a fillet back here. Okay, and now I'm going to let that one dry. Now, while we're still waiting for the engine mount glue to dry, we can go ahead and take our booster body tube, and here, so I don't mess up, I'm going to put aft on this. Okay, and now I'm going to put this on the fin template, like so. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is at each of these lines, I'm going to make a little mark on the body tube, and then we'll extend these once we get them all done. Okay, now we'll want to go to a door frame or a windowsill or use a marking guide like this. Okay, and what we're going to do is make a line all the way along from each of those points. So we're just going to extend a line along the booster. Now once we've got this assembled, we'll go ahead and temporarily couple it to the sustainer tube and extend these lines up onto the sustainer stage as well. I am still waiting for glue to dry on the motor mounts, so I'm going to go ahead and do some fin preparation steps here. So ideally, if they're still in the stock like this, you can sand their surfaces all at one time. So here, take some medium grit sandpaper, about 150 grit, and just sand the entire face. Alright, now these two sheets came off different parts of the tree or even different trees. And you can tell there's a lot of difference in the grain here. Now you can just use these as they are, but if the wood grain offends you or you just want a nice smooth fin here, we're going to want to fill this in. And for that you can use either a wood filler or a sanding sealer. Or you could use a paper laminate over the fins here. And if you look on the internet, you'll find videos for doing all those types of things. For mine, I'm going to use a polyurethane based sanding sealer, and I'll show you how to do that here. Alright, first we need to cut the fins out, and these are mostly cut through. These have been die cut, but they'll have little tabs holding them in. So just take your hobby knife and cut through those tabs for each one. Be careful not to damage the fins themselves. Now you may have noticed that we've got 6 fins for the upper stage here. And as far as I can tell, that's just the way they cut them. We're only using 4 fins on this. The booster fins look a little unusual in its grain pattern, and that's because this perpendicular edge here is the leading edge, this is the root edge, and so these are going to go on like this, where this tapered part is on the trailing edge. Okay, so first of all, let's go ahead and take your fins into a stack, like this. And and look for any obvious places where things are sticking up. Okay, and then we're going to run this across some medium grit sandpaper, like this. Alright, so get all your edges lined up and just pull it across the sandpaper a few times. That'll get everything more or less lined up. And then just do this for each edge. Okay, just stack them together, get all the edges even, and sand them. Alright, for the upper stage fins, I would go through and check and pick the ones that are in the best condition. Like some of them, looks like the die cut there was a little bit off, kind of crushed the fin there. And we've got a little bit of gouging. So I'll set the two worst ones aside. I won't throw them away just in case I break one. Now, just like with the booster fins, go ahead and stack the upper stage or sustainer fins together and do the same thing. Just sand each set of edges. With the fins cut out and sanded, the next thing we need to do is shape the leading edges. And so I'm going to use some 150 grit sandpaper here. Now, this is the booster fin, and remember, this is its leading edge. Okay, so I'm going to start by just rounding the edges there a little bit. Okay, and then just continue this back and forth until they're rounded over. Okay, and just check in cross section here. So those are almost rounded, just a little bit more. And just go all the way over. Okay, so that looks pretty good there. Just needs a little bit more on this end. Okay, and then if you need to, go ahead and just sand the root edge once or twice there, make sure it's smooth. Same with the tip edge. Now the trailing edge here, you can either leave that squared off like it is here, or you could round or taper that as well. Okay, and that's a trade-off. The more you taper the fins, the weaker they become, but the more aerodynamic they become. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of the booster fins off camera here. And here I've got one of the sustainer fins, and on this one the slanted edge here is the leading edge, and this one's going to be the same. Now in my kit, the balsa for the sustainer is a little bit less dense. It's sanding a lot quicker. I don't know if that's by design or just the batch of balsa they had. So just be aware that the two stocks used for the fins may not be the same. All right, the same way here, checking cross section, rounding those off. Okay, and then I'm just going to square the root edge here a couple of times. And same thing, if you want to taper the trailing edge, you can, or you can just square it off there. Okay, and I'm going to do the rest of those ones off camera as well. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, I plan to use some sanding sealer on my fins. And one of the things we'll need for this are some straight pins. You'll need one for each fin. Okay. And you want a piece of corrugated cardboard. Now you can use the edge of a box. In this case, this is a quick and dirty rocket stand that I have my students make, and so it works for this purpose as well. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to show you this with one of the sustainer fins and one of the booster fins, and then I'm going to do the rest of them off camera. So I'm going to take my pin and put it into the root edge. It doesn't have to go very far, and be careful that you don't pop it up on another side or poke it into your finger. Okay, my sanding sealer is a polyurethane based one, and there are several brands of this out there. I've just put it into a little jar to make it easier to work with and less likely to dry out. And you can either brush this on, or I'm just going to use a cotton applicator here. But this is going to sink down into the wood grain and fill that in. And that will make the fin smoother and also a bit stronger when it's all done. You'll probably want to use at least 2 coats of this. One is better than none. And if you decide to skip this step, you can. It just means when you go to paint this, the wood grain is going to show up more. Okay, but generally what I do is I'll put on a coat, let that dry for 2 to 3 hours, and then sand it with 220 grit or 320 grit sandpaper, just enough to make it smooth again. Because what we're trying to do is fill in the grooves, not necessarily build up on top of them. So when we sand this, we'll sand it down to the wood grain again, so that we expose any grain gaps that are still there. And then after I've sanded this, I will put another coat on it, let it dry for 2 to 3 hours, and then sand that with 320 to 400 grit sandpaper. Now if you've got limited sandpaper supply, what I would recommend is get yourself some 220 grit or 320 grit, so that'll be your fine sandpaper, and get yourself also some 150 grit, which is a medium grit. And so if you just have those two, like a 150 and a 320, you can work around just about anything here. All right, this is my booster fin. I'm doing the same thing. All right, and this will also help catch, if you've got little splinters or fuzzies like I've got here, this helps bind those down, and after your first sanding, that'll get rid of those. Okay, now if you do happen to get it on the root edge here, try not to, but if you do, you can just sand it out again. But you don't want we actually want the grain to be nice and porous there, because it'll help hold the glue better. Okay, so there's one of each fin, and I'm going to continue this off camera with all of the rest of the fins. And when I come back, I will have gone through the intermediate sanding, the second coat, and the final sanding. And again, if you want an even smoother finish, you can add a 3rd or 4th coat of this stuff. Okay, the glue on the engine mounts is finally dry, and we can go ahead and put these together. So for the booster one here, this is going to go in like this, and it'll be mounted flush with the aft end. Okay, so in doing this, I'm going to do a little trick here, if I can pull it off. So what you're going to need is an applicator for the glue. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to slide this in part way. Now up here on the forward end, I'm going to put some glue right around where the ring currently is. So it's right above that centering ring, and when I push this all the way in, it'll go right through that glue. All right, but I'm also going to put some glue down here on the aft end before I get that centering ring up there. And it's okay if you're a little bit sloppy around the tube there. Okay, mainly though we want to get it up inside the edge. And then that will glue the aft centering ring when we slide this all in. Okay, so I'm just going to put a little piece of paper down here protectively, put that in, slide that in there. Okay, and then I can put in some additional glue on top here. Alright, and that glue will also hold in the coupler. Okay, so we don't want to get it too soupy, but we do want a nice even amount of glue across there. Okay, so we're going to take one of the couplers, slide that in on top. Alright, and that's the booster all done and ready to go. I glued it to my paper there. Okay. Now down here on the bottom side, if you want, you can add some more glue to that. Just don't get it up inside the motor mount tube. But here you can get the seam between the body tube and the engine tube and that coupler. Alright, I'm just going to take my finger, run that around there. Make sure you get any glue that gets down in there. You want to take that out. Okay. So it's going to look like that. Go ahead and scrape off any other excess glue. And so this piece can dry like that. Okay, now we're going to do something similar for the upper stage tube. And mine actually got a little bit crunched somewhere. So I'm going to make that the aft end since we're going to glue stuff into this anyway. No, actually I'm going to put that on the forward end because the coupler that's going to go in here will strengthen it. Alright, so if you don't have a crunched end, it doesn't matter. Alright, so down here on the better end, I'm going to put aft once more. So this will be the aft end of the upper stage. And the upper stage can be flown all by itself without the booster. Okay, now I'm going to do something similar here. So this is going to fit in and is going to be flush there with the body tube. Okay, and like before, we want to be able to get glue on both rings. So here, I'm just going to take my applicator first of all and just get a rough measurement. Alright, so I'll put my thumbnail there, and so I want this just below that forward ring. So I can do that here. Alright, so I'm going to use my thumb as a guide. I'm going to put it into my thumb hits and then swirl that around the inside. Okay, now for the second one, I'm going to use the back end of my applicator. I'm just going to break off that head. Okay, so like I did with the other one, I'm going to slide this in partially before it hits the glue. And I'm going to stick some glue up inside here. Now don't use too much because the coupler is going to slide up in this region, and so we don't want a bunch of excess glue too far down. So most of the strength in this one is going to be on that upper centering ring. Okay, so now I'm going to put this in and I'm going to twist it as I go to help clear out any excess glue. Alright, and now once again I'll put this on a protective surface, right, and just squish that in. Okay, so now that's going to look like that. Now I'm not going to do this yet. Once it dries, we'll test fit it. Okay, but this is going to go in like this, and that will put the two motors, when they're installed, close to each other. Okay, so I'm going to let both of these dry now. Now this part is actually further back in the instructions. But it's something you can do just anytime you're waiting for glue to dry or sanding seal to dry or anything like that. And that is attaching the nose cone base to the nose itself. And so for this you're just going to need a little bit of plastic cement. If you notice I'm starting to slur in my old age. Alright, so I'm just going to run a bead of cement right on the inside edge here. You want a moderate amount. Don't have it so thick that it's going to melt everything. Alright, and then you just take this part, slide it in, run it back and forth a few times. Okay. And actually, I'm going to let this dry in an upright position as my glue is a little bit further up there than I wanted. You want it right on the inside edge because there's not a lot of lip on there. The glue is dry on my motor mounts and my coupler here for both the sustainer and the booster. And so next here I'm just going to go ahead and put this on. So put the booster in place. And remember, we made fin marks here for all of the booster fins. And now what I'm going to do is extend those up onto the sustainer. Okay, so here I'm going to use my line guide again. If you don't have one of these, you can use a door frame. I am going to put a small piece of masking tape on this, just to make sure it doesn't move. So I'll put that between two lines, right there. Okay, so now I can come over here, find the lines that I drew on the booster. Okay, and I'm just going to extend that all the way past here, right, and about a third of the way up the booster tube. That'll give us lots of room for sighting our fins. Okay, now in the instructions it doesn't give us a line for the launch lug. I'm going to put one in anyway. So here I'm just going to pick a point on the sustainer halfway between two fins. Right, I'll just put that back on here, and I'm going to draw this all the way up the length of the rocket. Okay, I don't need it on the booster, but I do need it on the sustainer. Having that go up all the way makes it easier to sight the launch lug. And then right beside this, I'm just going to write in launch lug. Before we glue the fins on, we need to make a few measurements here. And if we look at the instructions, the booster fins go on with the trailing edge flush with the edge of the booster's body tube. But the sustainer fins actually overlap the forward end of the booster stage a little bit. So they're not flush with the sustainer body tube. And this is probably, at least in part, to help keep it stable in flight. So the sustainer fins actually help keep this body tube on. All right. But to get the proper measurement, we need to go 5 inches from the aft end of the booster up onto the sustainer here. So I'm just going to make a mark at 5 inches right there. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and do that for each fin line. Okay, and I've already done it for that line there. And then while we're marking things, the aft end of the launch lug is supposed to be 4 inches from the base of the rocket. So including the booster, that's going to go right here. Okay. Now, our marks are going differently though. So the launch lug, this indicates the aft end of the launch lug, and so it'll go forward from here. But our fin marks here indicate the forward or leading edge of the fin, and it's going to come backwards. So just keep that in mind when we get to the gluing stage. Okay, the other thing we need to do is lightly roughen the body tubes here where the fins are going to go. So I'm just going to use some medium grit sandpaper here, and I'm just going to take a couple of strokes here. So this doesn't require a lot of sanding. All we're doing is removing the gloss from the cardboard where those fins are going to go, and this will give a better surface to which the glue can adhere. Alright, and then we'll go ahead and do the same thing up here on the upper stage. So I'm going to put one in for the launch lug there. Okay, and then for each of the upper fins. Something I want us to examine here a little later in the instructions. This shows gluing the extension tube to the main body tube using this coupler, and then after that attaching the shock cord using the standard glue type mount. This is similar to what Estes uses in their kits. If you look at it here, the only difference is that they fold this just a little bit differently than most kits do that have it. Okay, but you can do that if you want, and if you want to use the standard, go ahead and follow the instructions here. However, on my kit I want to change this a little bit, and I'm going to install a Kevlar shock cord. Okay, so this is 100-pound test Kevlar line. This is actually made by a kite supply company here. High performance kites will often use this. Now Kevlar has the advantage in that it's very lightweight, it doesn't take up much space, and it's pretty much fireproof. You know, it will burn given a hot enough condition, but it's really not affected by the temperatures of the ejection charge. The disadvantages to Kevlar are, one, it doesn't stretch, which means you have to use a lot of it. And the general rule of thumb is 3 times the rocket length. So this rocket is 22 inches long, or about 56 centimeters, and so we need 3 times that, or about 66 inches worth of the Kevlar. Okay, and that's not bad at all. Okay, and then the other disadvantage to this is because it is so strong and tough, it's also kind of abrasive. And so your chance of having a zipper where the shock cord can pull back on your body tube and cut it is increased. But I'll show a way around that as well. Okay, so in my case here, I'm going to go ahead and do this. So I said I needed 66 inches, and that is 5.5 feet. So there's 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, and I'm just going to go ahead and give it 6 feet. Okay, a little bit of extra won't hurt anything. Cut that off. Okay, now again, because of its narrowness and its abrasiveness, the typical glue-on type shock cord mounts don't work well for this. Typically a shock cord is tied on to the motor mount, but that was a little bit more difficult with this one. We could have done it, but since we have this coupler here, we can do it another way. So the first thing I'm going to do is find the center of this. Alright, so it's 1 inch long. So 1/2 inch would be the middle of it. As an alternative, if you have any BT50 24mm spacer tubes that come with a lot of rockets to properly place the engine block, you can use those as couplers as well. So this is a 24mm motor spacer from another kit, but it has the same diameter as this coupler. And so having a longer coupler in the tube adds a little bit of weight, but it also increases the strength as well as helps keeping it straighter while it's drying, because it's got more room here to help prevent that body tube from moving. And so just to show you what this would look like here, let's go ahead and get out the upper body tube. Okay, and our sustainer body tube. So the way this is supposed to go together is like this and like this. Alright, there's a little bit of wobble there, and it's simply because that coupler doesn't go very far. If we do the same thing here, okay, I'm going to go ahead and find its middle. So this is roughly 9 centimeters. So that would be at 4.5. Okay, if I use this as my coupler, I can put that in there all the way up to the halfway point, and then put this on top. Okay, it's still got a little bit of wiggle to it, but not as much. Okay, and notice this is a little buckle here. I told you my kit had a slightly crunched body tube right there. Having this long spacer in there helps stabilize that as well. Okay, so either using the coupler that came with it or an old spacer from another rocket, what I'm going to do now is poke a hole through either one of these. So on the supplied coupler, do this at about 1/4 inch, so halfway between the edge and the mark we made. Okay, same thing here you can do. I can actually do it a little bit further down, but we don't want to go too much. So I'm just going to go ahead and poke a hole in this. Make sure you don't poke the hole down to your finger. Alright, and you'll need one on either side. Okay, and now we're going to pass the Kevlar through. Now something you may need to do, the Kevlar tends to fray really badly, and you can fix this by adding just a little touch of super glue to it. Just a drop there. And then just take a tissue and wipe off the excess. Okay, and that'll be pretty much ready to go at that point. So now I'm going to put this through one hole from the outside. Okay, and then send it back through the other hole. Here you might want a pencil or something to kind of ream that open. Okay, and this is part of the reason you don't want to put this down too far, because the angle gets so high that you can't get through the hole. There we go. Okay. So now I'm going to tie a knot in this, and you can do this a couple of ways. You can tie a couple of half hitches on this and push it down. I'm actually just going to tie an overhand knot in both strands, but one of my strands is much longer than the other. Okay, so depending on how skinny your fingers are, you may need a little bit more room. Okay, so I've got both of them here. I'm just going to tie this in an overhand knot. Okay, so there's the short end, and the long end I'm going to pull all the way through. Okay, and then I'm just going to pull that up, leave myself a little bit of room on the free end, but don't waste a lot. Okay, Okay, so now it looks like this. Now, I'll tell you ahead of time, this is going to cause a little bit of bulging on this tube. So if you don't want your tube to bulge a little on each side, then go back to the traditional mount here. Okay, but what I'm going to do now, and I'm just dry fitting this at this point, I'm going to thread this through. Okay, and then this is going to come up in here. And now I'm going to pull on this till I get up to my mark there. Okay. The bulging is not too noticeable, so that's good. You may notice it more if you do it with the supplied coupler, just because it's a little bit more rigid. Okay, but then we would glue this in place. And now, if you kind of, let's see if you can look down in there. Okay, the shock cord is held in the center of our loop there and is firmly braced between the body tube and the coupler. Okay, which means this will have this is a really good anchor. All right, so we're ready to glue it in place. We'll go ahead and pull this back out. Okay, and one thing I'm going to do before packing it up completely is get my super glue again here. Okay, and I'm just going to apply a drop to the knot, and this will just help keep it from unraveling, as Kevlar can do. It doesn't hold knots well. Alright, so now we need some glue up inside of here, and the trick is not to get it all over the Kevlar. Okay, so I'm just going to use a small stick here, and I'm putting this up right on the inside edge. And we want to do it so that we've got a good film going around. Alright, and some's getting on the Kevlar, but that's fine. We'll worry about that in a minute. Okay, but do try to keep this distance as short as you can while you're doing it. Alright, now I'm going to pull this forward. Again, some of the glue is getting on the Kevlar. It's not a big deal. Okay, now we're in. And here I'm going to pull again, and you want to do this pretty rapidly so the glue doesn't set halfway in. Alright, bring that back here. And now looking down, I'm pulling my shock cord here. This is the final adjustment you can make. Okay, and now I'm going to let it dry in this position so that the Kevlar with any glue on it is not going to lay against the body tube and get stuck there. And I'm just going to set this aside to let it dry. My fins have been sanded, and in total I put on 2 layers of sanding sealer and sanded with 220 to 320 grit sandpaper in between and at the end. So now we can go ahead and attach these to our body tubes, both for the sustainer and for the booster. For this you can use wood glue or white glue. Now remember, this is the upper stage fin, and it's going to go on like this. All right, this is the lower stage fin, and this is its leading edge, so it's going to go on like this. Also recall that we measured with both of these together so that here is the top point for the forward fin. So when we put that on, the upper stage fin is actually going to hang down just a little bit there, and that's what we want. Okay, so we can do both stages at the same time here. You might want something handy to prop them against. I'm actually going to use my sanding tees here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with the upper stage. And here I'm just going to put a thin film of glue on. Okay, in this case more is not better. It's best just to have a nice thin film here. Okay, and then I'm going to, okay, so I forgot we don't need this all the way down. So scrape off a little bit of glue there. Okay, and now I'm going to put this again with the leading edge there at our mark. Okay, put that on and then take it off and let that get tacky for about 60 seconds. On the booster stage I can do the same thing. And this one we do need the glue all the way down. But again, just a thin film. And this is going to be flush. Nope. Keep forgetting that. So, yeah, the perpendicular edge there is the leading edge. Alright, and once more I'm going to touch that. Let that sit for 30 to 60 seconds. Okay, now my upper one, that's about enough time. And what this has done is make it a tackier surface. So now I can put this back on and it's going to stick better. Okay, and now just sight down the body tube, make sure the fin is straight, which mine is actually off a little bit there. Okay, and that it's perpendicular. Alright, and if you're using wood glue, let that dry for at least 5 to 10 minutes. Somewhere in there, depending on what the set time on your glue is. If you're using white glue, you may have to go up to 15 to 20 minutes so that it sets hard enough that it won't flop over on you. Okay, my lower stage fin now, we'll put that back on. Again, this one's going to be flush with the aft end. And once more, go ahead and check the alignment. Make sure it's perpendicular and let that one dry. Okay, once those fins have dried enough to work with, then you can proceed all the way around. I'm going to do that off camera. Once the fins are attached, we can go ahead and attach the launch lug. Alright, and that is going to go at this mark here, and that's going to mark the aft end of the launch lug. So our launch lug is going to go in like that. And this just goes on the same way the fins do, except you really don't have to do the wait for the tackiness part. Alright, so we'll just start with a thin bead of glue here. Put that on our line. Okay, and then just make sure that it all lines up. Look down the length of the rocket each way, and that looks pretty good. So we'll let that dry, and when we come back, we'll do the fillets all the way around. At this point, my glue is mostly dry, and certainly dry enough to handle. So I'm going to put fillets on everything here. So we'll start with the fins. Be careful around that launch lug. And don't forget the launch lug. Be kind of tight in there. Alright. Go ahead and have a paper towel or tissue handy. Alright, then we're just going to smooth this in. Okay, and then just move on to the next facing fins. Now if you're doing this with quick setting wood glue, alright, so like this has a clamp time of 10 minutes, that's pretty fast. You can just keep going to the next one. If you're using a slower setting wood glue or you're using white glue, give this at least 5 minutes before you go to the next face of fins. Now the question may come up, could you do this with the booster attached to it? And I would say no, because you don't want to have any chance of gluing the booster permanently onto the sustainer here. Alright, so I'm going to set this aside to dry horizontally, and then take the booster and do the same thing. Okay, you can see where I'm spray painting here, got a little on my finger. Alright, and this will go exactly the same way that you did with the sustainer. Okay, so fillets like this are good for strength. If you would like to build up your fillets for greater aerodynamics, you can do that as well, but do it in layers. Okay, so don't try and make a great big thick fillet all at once here. Do multiple fillets to build it up. And after you've done a glue fillet, you can use things like wood filler or plastic model putty to build up the streamlining part of your fillets. And that'll be a little bit lighter, and it's also quicker to do. So I'm also going to let this one set aside to dry, and then we'll come back here and start work on the recovery system.